In interphase, it's like the resting stage before the cell divides. So the DNA is in the nucleus, and the spindle fibers, which are part of pulling the cells into two, are not present yet. Next, in prophase is where the DNA copies and the sister chromatids line up next to each other, and the spindle fibers are still not present. In metaphase, the sister chromatids line up in the middle, and the spindle fibers start to form and attach to the end of the DNA. The next phase is anaphase, where the spindle fibers start to pull apart the sister chromatids. Here you can see that the purple strands and arrows are the spindle fibers, and the burgundy little loop things are the half of the sister chromatids, which are being pulled apart, which will soon pull the cell into two. The next phase is telophase, where the sister chromatids reach the end of the cell, and this is where the cell will start to split. The last phase in meiosis is cytokinesis, where the cell finally splits in half and new nuclei forms in each cell. And now the DNA is back in the nucleus, and the spindle fibers are on vacation until the next cell reaches metaphase. In the final result of the cells, they will end up being identical to the starting cell, because there will be one of each of the sister chromatids in each of the cells, because they split into two. So the final cells are identical. They are identical to the starting cell. Meiosis is basically the same process as mitosis, but instead of just one cycle, it goes through two separate cycles. And instead of starting with the sister chromatids, which are identical, they start with homologous chromosomes, which are just similar. Now, homologous chromosome is where one chromatid is an A and the other chromatid is a B, which makes them similar but not identical, because now in meiosis there are basically two sister chromatid pairs, but one pair is a pair of A's, one A and another A, and then the other pair is a pair of B's. But because there's one A and one B right next to each other, it's called a homologous chromosome. And the same thing as prophase in mitosis. The homologous chromosomes line up. The homologous chromosomes are next to each other in the cell. The next step is metaphase 1, because this happens twice. So the homologous chromosomes are lined up in the center. You can see that the homologous chromosomes are lined up in the center, and it's 4 chromatids wide instead of 2, because we're using homologous chromosomes instead of sister chromosomes. The next phase is anaphase, and instead of one chromatid being pulled to each direction, there's one sister chromatid pulled in each direction. So it will look like this. There will be one sister chromatid on each side when the spindle fibers pull them apart. Now is the first cell division, when it divides into 2 cells, and it has now sister chromatids in the cell instead of homologous chromatids. And the same cell division that happened in mitosis will now happen in meiosis, but instead of ending up with 2 cells, you end up with 4 cells. So both of these processes are a way to reproduce. Mitosis is the way to reproduce asexually, and meiosis is the way to reproduce sexually. Yeah. For each way to reproduce, there are different advantages and disadvantages for each reproducing system. For sexual reproduction, some environments that come in handy are ones that have a lot of species living there, because if you're living somewhere where there are not a lot of species, number one, you can't find a mate, but there's a lesser chance that you'll find one of your own species. And in a changing environment, because in a busy environment as well, because there's competition and some advantages of the sexual reproduction method is it allows for variation and adaptation, because when there's two parents, they most likely have something that's different about them. So the child will come out with both the mother's specialty and the father's specialty, hopefully, because if you reproduce asexually, then you would basically be doing that by yourself, and there would be no change because there's no other person to provide something different from what you can give the child. Some advantages for the asexual reproduction method is it gives you more kids and it takes less time because you don't have to actually go through the process because you're doing it by yourself. And some environments where asexual reproduction, being able to reproduce asexually, would come in handy was where there might be harsh environments, because in harsh environments there are probably not many of your kind, so it would be easier to just reproduce asexually. Where it's like empty or boring to a degree, because you don't really need anybody else to help you, because there wouldn't be anybody in a harsh or empty or boring world. So some disadvantages for sexual reproduction is that you have to take the time to actually make the children, and a disadvantage for asexual reproduction is there's no other person if there's a predator, there's no other parent to protect your kids. An example of a species that uses sexual reproduction is the grizzly bear. So what happens is the male deposits the sperm into the female, and the eggs don't begin developing until the female is actually in the den, which I think is pretty cool. An example of a thing that reproduces asexually is bacteria, and bacteria is in the stomach acid, so there aren't many living things down there, so that's why it reproduces asexually. Another example of an animal that reproduces sexually is a leafy sea dragon. The male carries and hatches the eggs, actually, instead of the female. And the female actually finds a potential dad and then deposits the eggs underneath its tail. And they can actually have up to 200 eggs at a time. Another example of an animal thing that reproduces asexually is a starfish. What the starfish does is breaks off a part of him, and then the part will soon expand into a full-grown starfish. Yeah.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.